So again, good morning and welcome to our participants in Morocco, in the United States, and Peru and Myanmar and around the world. So again, good morning, bonjour, salam, buenos dias. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar in our continuing series with Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University and the U.S. Embassy in Rabat. Before we begin today, we'd like to wish everyone a wonderful new year. It's been about a month and a half or so since, or even two, since we last came together for these webinars. And I think I speak for the entire Arizona State University and U.S. Embassy team that we so appreciate your continued attendance at these webinars and the warmth and generosity of our colleagues in Morocco and around the world. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being translated simultaneously into Arabic, and that Arabic translation can be found by selecting interpretation at the bottom bar of your screen. So thank you again so much for being here. Our topic today is going to be about aligning assessments to student learning outcomes. And I'm joined by two dear colleagues from Arizona State University. First, Dale Johnson, the Director of Digital Innovation, the University Design Institute at Arizona State University. And then Peter Van Loosen, who is the Director of Learning Experience and Student Success and a Clinical Associate Professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, also at Arizona State University. I'd like to invite our panelists to expand a bit on that short statement of their credentials. And Dale, would you mind starting us off?
Thank you, Stuart, and welcome everyone. My name is Dale Johnson. I'm the Director of Digital Innovation, as Stuart mentioned, at Arizona State. I've been working in education for about 35 years, and for the last 8 years here at Arizona State, helping support the development of online programs, adaptive instructional systems, and now digital innovation. So it's exciting to be with you. I look forward to sharing some ideas and then engaging in a good conversation at the end of the program. Now, welcome Peter to introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you, Dale, and thank you, Stuart. It's always good to be with you. My name is Peter Van Loosen. I'm the Director of Learning Experience and Student Success at Arizona State in a group called Ed+. We often work on some of these strategic initiatives that are important to the university, in particular, how to teach effectively and efficiently in large enrollment scenarios. That could be online, that could be face-to-face, or also what we're seeing right now in a synchronous Zoom type environment. In general, my background, I come from the K-12, or what we call the middle and high school environment here in the United States. My background is in education, and what I'm really interested in, what I'm researching, and what I'm trying to implement is trying to find the answer to the question, what is good teaching? And I had the pleasure to work closely with Dale as well as Stuart on trying to find that answer in certain contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dale and Peter. Before we jump into the presentation, which I'm eager to hear more about, I just want to share that we've covered in these webinars quite a bit of ground related to various topics such as universal design for learning. We've talked about academic integrity, and we've talked about designing authentic assessment. And I'm very excited that we have Dale and Peter here who will be able to do, I think, a little bit of gathering all that together for us in the beginning and launch us into new material. So it's my great pleasure to have us kick off with Dale Johnson.
Thanks again, Stuart. This is really going to start with a synthesis, as Stuart was mentioning. We're trying to pull together some of those ideas to show you how you get more benefit from integrating multiple best practices. Before we get started, we also want to know a little bit more about you. So we have two polls that we're going to run while we start off on this conversation. If you could launch the first poll, we'd like to find out a little bit more about your current position so that we can tailor our comments to your needs. So if you want to vote there, I'll give you a minute here to go ahead and tell us who you are. It looks like there's quite a few professors in the group. That's great. We've got some students, which is exciting also. So I'm happy to welcome the students especially because this is really about you and trying to help you succeed. So we're excited to have you here. We've got some support staff and some academic administrators. It looks like we're about halfway through the number of voters. I'll give you another 10 seconds to vote if you'd like. And I'll share the results. There we go. So mostly faculty members, and that's what we would have expected. So we're happy that you're here, and we look forward to your questions. This is going to be approximately 50 to 60 minutes of presentation and then another 30 minutes of discussion. We also are taking questions in chat, or I believe in the Q&A also. So if you wanted to drop a question in there during the process, Stuart will be looking at those and he can ask us questions during the presentation. The academic administrators and support staff, both Peter and I have served in those roles, so we're excited to have this conversation with you as well. Welcome everybody. And we had one other poll, just a quick yes or no poll. So how many of you have attended a webinar before? Looks like the majority. I'm seeing about 80%. As I mentioned, we'll do a little bit of review and some of the early synthesis just to reset and make sure everybody's back on the same page and do the additional information that Peter and I prepared. So I'm going to end polling in a few more seconds. It looks like most of you have. Oh, good. So we've ended that and we're going to share results. So 80-20. And I think that that's a good thing because you also know how we proceed with these, and you can bring some questions from the past. Let's say you've got a question that you feel didn't get fully answered in a previous session. Feel free to ask that here as well. We'll do our best to make sure that you get the information that you need to succeed there. So we'll start out with the big question, why should you be aligning your assessments and learning outcomes? This is the primary question for everyone, because this is what implies that we have to do the work. If we can't answer the question why, then there's no reason to do it. So let's start off with this. And I start with a funny illustration of why we need alignment. If we don't have alignment in engineering, we get failure in systems and structure. And it's the same in education. If we don't have alignment in our assessments and learning objectives, then we're going to get failure. And that failure is primarily student failure. That's where we cause problems if we're not thinking about how to align these elements. So we'll talk a little bit about what those elements are, and then we'll get into the reasons why. Today, our working hypothesis is that learning outcomes, this is the statement of what learners should know or be able to do at the end of the learning experience, plus the assessments, those are the methods to evaluate, measure, and document the academic readiness, progress, skills, or needs of the learners, plus the alignment. This is the coherence in the course, curriculum, program, initiative, or even the entire educational system. Those three elements, if you add them all together, you get more successful students. This is our objective. We want to assist the students in successfully completing their degree. So throughout this conversation today, we're going to put together these elements to try to help you get the students through your course or through your degree program or through your university more successfully. Now we have to do that by providing better information to both the learners and the professors. The learners benefit from the alignment between assessment and learning objectives because they get measurement of their achievement. We all think of this as the grade. So that's the first thing students want to know. What's my grade on the exam, or what's my grade on the report? The second piece of benefit is the progress monitoring. We can help them see how they're progressing through the course. Also, we can assess growth over time. Sometimes students that have a very low starting point in their knowledge will benefit tremendously from having good assessment. And finally, the benefit for the learners is better feedback. If we do a good job of aligning our assessments and our learning outcomes, then we give them better information. So for the professors in the group today, you also get benefits from this. You get to determine the level of knowledge of the students. And that's very important, as you know, as you start your course, understanding where the learners are is a first step to success. Then you can use the information to personalize their instruction. If you have some students who are doing really well on the assessments, you're able to direct them to additional opportunities to learn. If you have some students that are not doing very well, you can focus on them to help them more. We'll talk about some of the tools and techniques for doing this today too. You have scarce time and resources, so allocating them appropriately can be guided by the proper assessment aligned to your learning outcomes. We want to be able to use your time to the maximum benefit of the students. And finally, if you think about the big picture, in your course, you have to determine what to improve. You might have a really good lesson on one subject, but a lesson that's not doing as well on another. And you have to know that. So assessment and learning outcomes are critical to alignment around your course improvement. We want to think a lot about how to help you evaluate your course effectiveness. So helping to evaluate the quality of the courses is a very complex subject. At Arizona State University, we use tools like Quality Matters. This is a resource that's available for the evaluation of courses. It includes elements of the alignment between all of the variables in the course and the learning outcomes. So as you think about how to continuously improve your course, this is the toolkit that you have at your disposal. And we'll be happy to share more information about these in either the chat or afterwards through the follow-up. And then finally, we want to support the continuous improvement process. There's a term for this we call the 360-degree review. Look at all aspects of a course, the pass rates of the students, the withdrawal rates if they drop out, the final grades of the students. All of these elements can be evaluated. And what we want to do is we want to use the alignment between assessment and learning outcomes to guide us in this process. So think about this as an investment in learners, in the professor's time, and in the course improvement. So the second big question we wanted to address today is, how do you create this alignment? This is really important because in the grand scheme of things, the work that you have to do is in this section. This is the first step towards building that alignment.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. I'm not sure if we want to give people the opportunity to ask some questions into your previous part as well. I don't know, Stuart, do we see anything particular popping up right now before we go into it?
No, I think that's a great introduction, and I think people, Dale and Peter, really appreciate the image of the bridge, right? So it's always that awkward moment, right? And we've talked about this and other things, like we should not get to the last piece of the bridge to discover that it's misaligned, right? That we should know from the beginning where we're trying to go and constantly course correcting. And so I think it's a wonderful image to think about. And I think, I'm guessing, Peter, that backwards design is one of those ways we get the bridge to connect throughout the whole course and at the end as well.
Yeah, excellent connection here. As you said, yeah, we want to constantly know where we're going, and we want to constantly know where we want to steer our learners, right? So like we're trying to build bridges that connect. We want to help our learners connect the various pieces of the course so that they are successful in their assessment, and as Dale pointed out, can graduate, can certify their achievement, and so on. And it's my understanding that in the previous webinar that you guys are familiar with this quite popular process that we are going to go through here in the next couple slides. It is backwards design by Wiggins and McTee. And as Stuart alluded to, there's a relationship between the various variables that are, or various components of a course, right? And in general, as we want to start with the learning objectives. And these really are statements that express what our learners should know, what should they be able to do at the end of a particular learning experience. That can be a unit, that can be a course, that can be a program, and so on. So that's really the starting point, right? We want to start, hey, what at the end of this whole initiative, what should my learners know or should be able to do? Because that relates directly to the assessments. And the assessments are really what helps you measure the what you want your students to know or what do you want them to do, right? So there are different forms, and we're going to talk about these in a little bit as well, and the different purposes of assessments. But it might be if you want them to start changing a tire on a car, they have to perform actually changing a tire on the car and so on, and we have to observe it, and so on. But then with that in mind, when you know, okay, you know the goal, you know how to assess them, you have to think about how do I get my students to that point that they are successful in, say, changing the tire at the car. And you want them to know the tools, you want them to know how to maybe unmount the tire, you want them to how to change the various components of a tire so they can fix it, and then also restore it to the previous state that everything is fixed. So, and that's where the activities come in, right? So you have to think about what do your students already know when they come into the class? What is the pre-existing knowledge? What are some of the scaffolds or steps that are needed to get from this pre-existing knowledge to the end knowledge, which is we will assess. And if Dale, if you could move on, thank you. So, and I'm going to break down this process in the next couple of slides a little bit more. But really the first step is to think about when you start creating alignment is, okay, define the objectives, start with the end in mind. What are the results that students should achieve at the end of a particular learning experience? That again helps you determine the assessments and how you will know, how you will observe, how you will measure the students' knowledge and performance. And then at the end, you will need to determine the particular learning experience that are needed. There might be some instructions like lectures. There might be some need for research. There might be some need for conversations, observations, and practice in order to get to that particular point in order to be successful. So, and as briefly mentioned, so having that relationship of these three components, these components can be can occur on different levels. So let's assume you are, we have a lot of professors here. You are planning an academic program, say a bachelor degree. You know, you have to set your objectives for this bachelor degree. What should students know at the end of all these courses that they should go through in order to meet the objectives of this degree? How will you know that they understand all the important concepts as well as can perform the skills? And then what are the activities that are needed in order to get to this point? So with this overarching umbrella, you can also dive one step deeper and go look at each individual course. You can determine the course objectives, assessments, and activities. And if you even want to go deeper, you can look into the individual units. That might be a weekly lesson, that might be a module that is independent of time, and so on. But really what it is, what we're trying to create here is a structure that aligns all the objectives from the top down to the assessments and so on. So it might be a good opportunity quick to check in and the chat again or make connections to previous webinars. Stuart.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, an excellent sort of overview of this topic. Two questions maybe just to ponder, to get some initial reaction from the two of you on, right? So I love this presentation of the Wiggins and McTighe triangle. And I'm wondering if there's also a dimension of this. We say know and do. One of the things we've also talked about in previous webinars is how we want students to be. Like, so what are their habits of mind? What are their approaches? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to that dimension of attitudes, approaches, et cetera, and how that fits within this as well.
That's a great question, Stuart. I think that we think of that as a third dimension. So when you look at that triangle, it's a two-dimensional diagram. And when you start adding in that student component and their particular outcomes that will be useful for them in a career, that's when you add and enrich the development of the materials. You could still think of that as part of the backward design process. And I'll talk more about that later, how we integrate what we call professional skills like communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking into this process. So those can still be objectives for any given unit or any given course, but that integration of those more higher order thinking processes into your curriculum is really a critical part of student success.
Yeah, and just to build upon this, so you know, a lot of these confidence builders, motivation really falls in the area of motivation, right? And something that Dale in his intro pointed at is learners benefit a lot from seeing how they progress and how they, you know, how that they master achievements, right, and performance. And by addressing these, by making sure they get the feedback that they need at the right time, you know, that can address a lot of these, what you called emotional components.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I know that that is an important dimension of what we do and oftentimes is overlooked. And I think the follow on, and I think Dale, you kind of hinted at this, as did you, Peter, which is there's a tendency, I think, and we've touched on this before, to look at it as this process as efficiency, right? How do we kind of do this model so that we can do assessment at scale as quickly as possible? And I'm wondering, and we might touch on this a little bit later, how personalized assessment works within this. So if we're talking about things around like that students have some agency to choose how they want to meet a requirement, does this model still fit, or does it presume a kind of master plan from the professor or lead teacher?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the lead on this. I know that at the later part, we actually speak, or Dale is going to speak directly about some of our personalized learning initiatives that we're doing. And yes, so the short answer, yes, it's certainly possible to create a highly personalized environment with this framework in mind. As we alluded to, and we'll present a little bit later, there are various methods of, or there are a variety of methods of assessments. And they don't necessarily have to be standardized and so on. At times you want to give learners, particular adult learners, the option how to demonstrate their skills and their achievements. So for some people, with the right design, you might give learners the choice to write a reflective essay, while for other learners, they might want to do a reflective video recording, where they have a vlog and think about what they have learned and so on as well. So all of these could demonstrate that students have, attained whatever the material was, and also are able to express it. So it's just a different form. So I don't know, Dale, do you want to supplement this?
Yeah, I would add that structure does not imply standardization. We build the structure to give us a foundation to be creative, to offer students alternatives. Without structure, then we have chaos. So I don't want you to imply, just because you build an aligned curriculum, that you have to have standardization. That's not a good correlation.
So I like that so much. I want to make sure that I caught it, Dale, which is that structure does not imply standardization, right? So we can be structured and at the same time highly personalized to the qualities of the learners in our particular class.
Yes, and we have
Wonderful.
an example of that at scale that I'll talk about in a few minutes.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive into this next section.
So you've been looking at this question for a few moments. What are some ways to structure this alignment? And Peter will talk a little bit about these other foundational components here.
Yeah, and just to briefly comment on structure.
We have a survey. If you wouldn't mind, we'd like to know if you've ever seen Bloom's taxonomy before. So while Peter's talking, would you mind answering this question? Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to comment briefly on what we are talking about, like structure does not mean standardization. And I'm a big sports guy. I'm a big soccer fan of football and the rest of the world. And, the way I think about it, people might have different formations, how they play, but they need to be fluid in order to respond to the elements, to respond to the opponent, and to the situation at times. So we go in with a framework, a certain plan, but at the same time, we need to be agile in order to adjust for certain situations.
So we have an 80-20 balance again in the polling. And it's good that most of you have heard of Bloom's. I'm going to close this poll so you can see the graphic again. But for those who have not, it's a very useful organizational tool. It's not the only way to think about educational development, but it provides one structure. And we recommend you look at it as a simplification of the very complex learning process. So go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, what we previously talked about with backward design is the relationship of the various components in the course. But what we're looking at here is also that, hey, there are different levels of learning and different cognitive tasks that need to be performed in order to address these different learning. We all know that identifying maybe a certain tool and saying this is a wrench and saying this is a tire is easier than actually trying to change the tire directly. So in all these, this allows you to create some kind of taxonomy. And there are different taxonomies in the world. Something that's very popular, especially in the US, is Bloom's taxonomy. And I'm happy to hear that so many people have already heard about this. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But as we know, this is a way to order the different type of cognitive tasks and levels that you will be assessing or we need to be assessed. And some of them are easier, some of them are harder to assess. So in addition, also not just about the levels of learning, something also to think about when the assessments can be conducted in the instructional process. And David Merrill, I'm a big fan of him. He pretty much did a meta review of the various instructional models that are out there. Gagne is very popular and so on. But pretty much he identified 5 key components or 5 principles. So first of all, when teaching, everything should be centered around the problem or task. And in order to be successful, there needs to be some kind of activation, demonstration, application, and integration. And assessments can fit in each of these phases, right? So in order to activate, for example, it's very, very popular to have what we call a pre-test. So you want to, first day of class, understand where your students are, what they know already about a certain topic, because that will allow you to customize, to align the rest of the instructional process. And then you can continue.
Activated them with that survey of whether they knew Bloom's or not. So
yeah,
we just demonstrated how you can use a simple survey at the beginning of your class, even if they just raise their hands. If they don't have technology, that's okay. You have to start to engage them in the conversation to activate learning.
Yeah, thank you. Great point. Yeah, and this can continue through all these different phases that we have identified. And the more frequent you assess, you can use this feedback, or you can provide feedback to learners, whether they are on the right track. Learners can see or gauge on their own whether they're on the right track. And also as instructors, we can see whether we are actually effective about the different, with our different activities and so on that we have designed for the learning experience. So I think, Dale, I know we talked a little bit about giving options and giving different types of assessments. I think that's our next part, but maybe that's again another good point for Stuart to see what's going on in the chat. I see there's a lot of communication going on, but maybe there's also certain questions that we like to address.
Yeah, and I see Hassan has his hand up. So if we'd like to either unmute Hassan or possibly look in the chat and see if he's posted a question, we can stop here for a moment.
Yeah. So Hassan, please feel free to add your question in the chat. There's two questions that I want to kind of pull out, and I want to also acknowledge the questions in the chat that have to do with the whether these are face-to-face or techniques for face-to-face classes, or whether they can be used in online or internet context. And I think we're going to get to that in a few moments. But I want to pull out two questions that are in the chat. One has to do with, as we think about, has to do with a question about disaggregation and division. So as we think about, I think the slide that you presented that had the sort of unit level, module level, program or course level, right? That you can look at various different levels when you're designing, sort of your triangle that we talked about earlier. So is there a risk, or how do we speak to the fact that if we break things down to such a small level, do they actually add back up to a whole, right? So if I teach, like if everything is so discrete, does it actually lead to a holistic learning of a concept of an area? So I think going back to that idea of changing the tire, right? So if we teach them all the discrete parts, do they know how to do every piece of changing a tire, but still can't change the tire? And I'm wondering, maybe Dale, you might be interested in kind of taking that one.
Let's look at the analog of this. In a book, you have chapters, you have sub-chapters, and you might even have subsections in the book, but there's still a story in the textbook. And this is the same for your course. You can have individual lessons that are discrete and built around the triangle that you can then connect with your story. We'll talk a little bit about active learning in a minute. This is a very smart audience, I can tell, because you're asking really good questions, and we have already some slides prepared just for these questions. So you're anticipating our session quite well. But that's the way we think about it, is the professor is the leader of this process. And as you lead the students through the learning experience, there are lessons that they have to learn along the way. So they are integrated as part of that overall learning experience.
Mhm. Thank you so much for that answer, Dale. And Peter, I'm wondering if you could touch on this other question, which is, and maybe it's just a preview of something you're going to talk about later, which is, if we know where students want to go, right? If we know what we want them to accomplish, where is the room for exploration or productive failure in that? And so if we have how does that fit in? I think speaking to what Zara has put into the QA around, how do we work with this kind of productive exploration rather than a kind of prescriptive meeting the requirements of the course?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and a very important question, in particular in today's time where we're living in a world where knowledge is constantly changing, and there are actually statistics out there, or when you say you start a certain degree program and 4 years later you get out of it, a lot of the material that you were taught is outdated and so on, right? So this is a really important where this framework really comes to play and how you set up the learning objectives, right? So, you really, in particular, the trends right now are to focus on preparing students with the skills that they can adopt to the new environment once they graduate. So something that we're talking about is critical thinking, making sure that they can synthesize information and so on. Can they collaborate with in a group or in a team in order to be successful and so on. As instructors, we can help prepare them for this by having our learning assessments as well as our activities simulate these, or and depending on how higher you are, how more advanced you go into the program, actually apply these. So that way they can develop these skills that can be applied to pretty much any type of environment and so on. And thank you, Dale, for pulling up this slide. So this is something that supports this. So we really want to achieve these higher order thinking skills, because we know that learners who can apply those will be successful in the future as information changes.
We used to imagine that students weren't ready for analysis, evaluation, creativity, and we used to make them wait. In the American system, and I studied in Spain in the Polytechnic in Barcelona, and their system was very similar. It was not until you were in grad school fifth year, sixth year, or PhD program that you were doing the higher level blooms. But in the United States now, the movement is to introduce these learning outcomes early in the learning experience. So first year students are applying, analyzing, evaluating, and even creating. We have maker spaces and we have other resources to encourage them to apply what they're learning. So as you think about not just your alignment between assessment and learning objectives, but also the learning objectives that encourage them to engage in higher order thinking and that offer them opportunities to do so.
And maybe just one final thing on that I think was very front of mind for me was that not every learner in your class is going to be in the same situation, right? So some might be, I wouldn't say ready to create, but some might be interested in creating. Some might want to, that taxonomy assumes that, for example, analysis is in a sense lower than creation, but really it's just a spectrum of strategies rather than a kind of hierarchy that says only people, right, who have done all the other things can get to creation. Instead, we could maybe view it as like a spectrum of options rather than a hierarchy of choices or building towards the top of the pyramid. Would that be accurate?
Yes, and that's really a better way to think about all of these activities, that there's a natural fluidity to all of this. You know, we think about creative people who don't have formal education and can still do that type of work. So we're not saying you have to wait anymore. We're saying you have an innate ability to create, and we want to help you discover that and develop it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Let's talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, what are some different kinds of assessments? So this is more of a technical aspect now. We've been talking about the philosophy and some of the strategies. So we'll talk a little bit about the tactics now. The first thing we want you to understand is these two different typologies, formative and summative. And the best way to think about this is a formative assessment is when the chef tastes the couscous, and the summative assessment is when the guests taste the couscous. So two different types, both are critical to the success of the couscous. And you have to look at your curriculum and your course and determine when is it important for a formative assessment and when is it important for you to have a summative assessment. For us, just like Stuart described, this is a spectrum. It's not an either or. You don't want to just have a summative assessment at the end of your course because you don't really get a chance to understand how well the students are learning during the formative period. So we think of this as a continuum where we bring both formative and summative to every challenge. So here's another example of a spectrum of different types of assessments. On the formative side, you might have a self-assessment or even a peer assessment where two students are able to talk to each other about their particular theory of the problem that you've presented. We also use portfolios at Arizona State University where students can collect their knowledge and then archive it and use it in the future. You've probably heard the term rubric before. A rubric is a framework for assessment. So if you're giving someone a writing assignment, you need to think about how you're going to grade it. Getting your grading rubric, which is really your learning outcomes, together with your assessment structure and putting them in the right organization helps you grade effectively and helps the students understand what you want. We have exhibitions, for example, presentations. Those are really important for developing the higher order thinking skills, and standardized tests still have a role in every curriculum. And most faculty members will have a combination of some collection of these, the outcome is really dependent upon the needs of the course, the type of course you have. If you have a literature course, you might require more writing. If you have an engineering course, you might require more calculation, but you can use all of these different assessments. Another way to think of it is this continuum from very simple to very complex. So a simple assessment would be something called a think, pair, share. When you are doing a lecture and you ask a student a question, you have them answer first as an individual, then you pair them with a classmate to their right, and those two people talk, that's the pairing, and they share the knowledge so they get to talk to each other during class. This is a technique that allows them to correct their own mistakes. If you have 200 people in the classroom, you're not able to correct every student. So you can use think, pair, share as a technique to help you do these formative assessments. Another example is a jigsaw discussion, where it's much more sophisticated and complex. And on that side, you have to organize a structure to the process so that you can effectively assess it. So this is another reference, O'Neill and Pinder Grover, that you can look for that will give you some ideas here about how you can change your assessment strategy. So jigsaw is essentially 4 different sets of information you give to 4 different students, and they have to put it together. And I had a very exciting experience with this when I was in high school, and we did this exercise where each of us got a clue and we had to solve the problem. And I learned a lot. I still remember 42 years later that experience. So it had a very large impact on me and my learning development. So thinking about how to introduce these ideas to your curriculum is part of the evolution in assessment. You know, another example we have at Arizona State is Introduction to Biology. It is a large course. There are 450 students. And in the past, we used to lecture. So we had a very large auditorium, and the students would listen to the lecture, and then they would take 2 summative assessments, and that was it. And we changed that whole design so that we could introduce formative assessment in addition to summative. So now the course looks like this, where students work in small groups, and we can give each group a problem to solve. So the professor creates the problems and the students work in small teams. This allows them to develop the higher order thinking skills and to introduce a new form of assessment. Now, we still have the lectures, but we have recorded them and they are available online. We've digitally produced all of the lectures so students can watch them. This model is often called a flipped classroom, or sometimes a blended or hybrid. You can do this if you have access to very simple video technology, like your telephone. You can record your lectures, and if you have someplace to store them, like an LMS, this opens up many, many opportunities for learning that didn't exist before. So let's talk now about how you can use the results of these assessments. So you've developed new assessments, but what do you do with that information? And how do you apply it to the challenges that you face? And we'll give you some examples now of this. You probably encounter this site in your classroom where you have hundreds of students and you are lecturing and they're taking notes, some of them using computers, some on their telephones, some using their notebooks. The problem that we have as educators is we cannot answer these basic questions. Like, who needs help? What do they need help with? What's the best way to help? We need formative assessment. We need information. So Arizona State University developed a dashboard for our professors. This is using information from multiple assessments. We have homework, quizzes, a classroom quiz called QuizMe, and summative tests. All of these elements can be analyzed, and you can evaluate whether students are on track. So this kind of tool, it might be difficult to develop at your university, but you could come up with a basic spreadsheet to do something similar. It allows us to identify the students who are on track so we can encourage them to keep going, but also, perhaps more importantly, what students are off track. These are students that are falling behind, and we have to find these students. We have to zoom in and help them. We can't just assume that they're going to do all of the learning on their own. So our model is to generate more information using formative and summative assessments, and then integrate that with our learning outcomes so that we can find the students that need help. Again, you can do that with a spreadsheet in your class if you have quizzes and homeworks and other grades that you can include in that process. I'll show you one that's more sophisticated now using a software called Alex from McGraw-Hill. We decided to integrate this as a continuous assessment. This is a brand new technique. Rather than thinking about assessment as a moment in time, this is continuously assessing the student during the learning process. What Alex does is it generates new insight for our professors and for our students. And that insight is delivered in the form of an information graphic. Each one of these colored lines is a personalized learning pathway through college algebra. This is about 100 students. And what we did was first, all the professors defined all of the topics that they wanted to cover in the class. That's the vertical axis. This is the September or August to December semester. So this is our fall semester. And the first thing you'll notice is all of the students start in different places. Alex has the ability to analyze the student knowledge before the class begins and allows the students to see where they are in the curriculum. Now, that's something that we could never do before. This is a brand new process for us, and it totally changes the way we think about assessment, because you have some students that go from zero knowledge to completion in one semester. And what you're looking at here is the personalized learning pathway for that student. So when they go vertical is when they're successfully completing the assessment, and when they're horizontal, they are struggling to learn the material. So the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is accomplishment. Now, you also have students that are successful and complete the course early. These are students that already have a lot of algebra knowledge. So we had to change our assessment strategy. We don't wait until December to give them the final exam. They take the final exam in October. This is the new model for us. Test when ready for this college algebra class. This student will finish faster because they came with more knowledge. You cannot teach those two students the same because they have different knowledge needs. The third student I want to highlight is the one that's struggling. And this is the insight that we're searching for. How do we help this student succeed when they do well for 2 months and then they struggle? We have to help develop new activities to introduce to them the opportunity to learn this material. In our case, with the scale of our university, we had over 10,000 students take college algebra last year. And we implemented this new model in the fall of 2016. And you can see it has significantly increased our student success rate. This is the level of students who are passing the course in their first attempt. And for us, it's important that we continue to improve so that more students can successfully graduate. It goes back to the original hypothesis. If we provide alignment and continuous assessment, we're seeing improved outcomes. That's the goal.
So Dale, I'm wondering if we could maybe unpack this a little bit more, because perhaps I'm alone in this, but when you showed the first version of the slide with all the lines, it was almost terrifying. Yeah, this one is a good example. So I maybe want to unpack a little bit. So this is a digital system, right? So Alex is an online learning platform, right? Designed actually by a third-party publisher, right? I believe it's
It was designed by professors at the University of California.
And then
so
was
from a U.S. university.
Wow. So we, in a sense, as a university, acquired this, right? So we didn't build it at Arizona State University. We actually took advantage of available technology and integrated it into our system. So there's often a question, and I think it occurred in this webinar as well, which is, so you mentioned one of the things is test when ready, right? What, in your experience, Peter and Dale, please feel free to jump in on this one. That seems to be a culture shift in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
Where a student could literally finish a course in the middle of a semester and then could, I presume, stop, in a sense, showing up, right? So in other words, you've met the requirements of the course is now over for you. Whereas for certain students, right, it takes all the way up until the end of the semester, right, to meet sufficient mastery to consider passing the course.
Yes.
What was the cultural shifts that had to happen for that even to be a consideration?
It was a massive cultural shift for our professors. So the first thing they had to understand was the idea of mastery. When someone says you have successfully mastered the assessment, that means that you are able to demonstrate your skill. It goes back to what Peter was describing as the change the tire analogy. If you cannot successfully demonstrate that, then you have to continue to study and learn. So in this case, the ALEX system is testing the students for their mastery. Now, this is a system that is available to Moroccan universities. You can license it. It's being used in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and also in Dubai at universities there as well. So it's a global product. It comes in English and Spanish currently, not in Arabic, unfortunately. But the idea is the same. You have to move away from what we used to focus on, which was the summative assessment, and change your culture to reflect continuous assessment. I encourage you to go to alex.com if you are fascinated by this concept and take their initial knowledge check. You can actually take this product and use it as an individual as part of a trial to test it. You'll see it's got a lot of very powerful information and has a teaching approach that's different from our traditional model. I would add just one more thing, Stuart, that this has always been true, but we never had the tools to do our teaching differently in the past. So it has always been true, and it is true in every course, that some students are better prepared at the beginning of course than other students. So all we're doing is we're recognizing that reality, and we are bringing new assessment tools to help the teachers.
If I might suggest, so of course, it's a massive change for the instructor, for the professor, but there are other changes that need to be considered. One very obviously is policies. What happens if students finish early? Do they need to come to class, or can they take a next class? There's something for the learners that need to be considered as well. Most of the learners are what we learned were not needed some help with that kind of assessment and kind of activities as well, because that's new to them as well. So there needs to be some support mechanisms as well. In addition, in order to help our faculty as well as our learners, what we tend to look at is at digital technologies as well as the course design. And we are fortunate to have a very strong team of instructional designers that can work and support our great faculty that we have at ASU in order to really analyze what are really the consequences of having such a technology being introduced, and how does it impact the pedagogy, how does it impact the activities in the classroom, and how does it implement the assessments, right? And that's something we are very fortunate to have, but we know as a university that this is not an easy undertaking, and that needs to be done in a collaborative way with people coming together with different expertise in course design, assessment, technology, subject matter expertise, and so on.
Yeah, and I would add one other thought. It took over a year for this team of professors to make that cultural change. So don't expect that everyone will embrace this idea. It requires a team approach, and you have to work together to help each other understand all of these changes. As you see, the benefits are worthwhile, but it did require significant investment.
Mm-hmm. And I think as you mentioned, and I want to make sure that we have sufficient time for the next section that you're presenting as well. I really appreciate you emphasizing that this is a process, right? It didn't just sort of land one day and everyone adopted it. I think it's really important. Again, that idea that what we're reflecting is really reality, right? Is that students enter into any course, right, with varying degrees of understanding and prior knowledge of the content that will be taught in that course. And it's probably true that many times, whether we intend to or not, we start from the perspective in the academy, in universities, that students know nothing. And therefore, it's kind of our job to fill them up with this new information, as opposed to draw out or draw on prior knowledge or prior experience. So I think that's very impactful. And
Yes.
what I also hear you saying is that it's possible to do this without the benefits of, say, a really robust technological infrastructure. But I did interrupt you, Dale, so I want to give you an opportunity to respond.
I just wanted to say that what we're trying to do is change 2,000 years of educational culture. What we have is a Greek amphitheater that has been passed down to us through the ages via the various manifestations. And it's only in the last 10 years that we have finally developed new technology beyond the large amphitheater that allows us to do this. So part of the cultural change is time. And it will take time to make that adjustment in Morocco, in the United States, everywhere in the world.
Mhm. Thank you so much for that. Let's continue our journey.
Yeah, Peter, let me just finish this last section here, and then we will be in our final question, I believe. There are different types of uses for this alignment. So we think about the alignment between assessments and learning outcomes, and we need to use that information. So we do design process review when we're thinking about the design of the course, and then course outcomes review. What you saw with that last graphic with the 17 percentage point increase is a course outcome review. We do that every semester to look at whether we are improving. If the course results, that is the student success rate, is not going up, then we go back to the design process review. And this cycle continues. So that's where we're headed with this type of information. And we'll finish with a couple of comments on trends. Start off with Peter talking a little bit about what are we doing now to prepare for the future?
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is always very insightful to see, the results and knowing how much work went into this to make it happen. A brief comment as well. I know, Stuart, you raised the question about whether we're doing this online as well. And I can confirm that we are doing this. All these different type of assessments that we discussed earlier or presented, the flipped classroom model, and so on. What is changing is a little bit the design and maybe the technology that are being used. Instead of maybe raising the hand, which you would do in a physical classroom, you might want to use, like we have here, like a virtual hand or a clicker system and so on. So in this section, we're going to take a step back and look at what are some current trends that we are seeing in higher education, in particular in the United States. So these are efforts that I think a lot of institutions are working on. There are different levels of progress and so on, but I would say not everybody has figured this out at this time. And I got the pleasure to talk about the big topic of learning analytics. And we saw already a little bit in Dale's presentation, where we see people taking really advantage of the data that each individual student provides when interacting with these different systems that we have. In our math example, that system was Alex, but there are other systems that we have at our universities. I know somebody asked about what is a LMS. This is a learning management system where students can see their grades, students can see their assignments, and so on. I know not every culture in every country has an LMS, and data privacy laws are very different across the world. But in the US, we have the ability to look at different sources. So we can look at what students are doing within the class. We saw some of that with Dale, like assessments and their pathways and so on. But we can also connect that to other sources, like say we know the demographics. So, and that allows us to see really like the different age groups and how our students are performing in our courses. And at times, we can see that we can make adjustments to our design, because explaining a certain context to a 3-year-old is very different than to a 30-year-old. And that impacts how we present our information. In addition, it allows us to, really get a clear understanding of who our learners are, how they're engaged with our learning materials, and really review our different processes based on the effectiveness and so on. Another trend, is what we've hinted at, is something called active learning. It's a much student-centered approach, where we saw that in the math example as well, where we shifted from the lecture style model, where students were passive and listening to the instructor, to a much more team-based, group-oriented instructional model. You saw that in the picture where students were sitting around the table and so on. We still provide the information, but we recorded those and students have to consume it before they come to class. In addition, instead of transmitting information, we are focusing on really hitting these higher order thinking skills like applying, synthesizing, and so on, which are needed for our students to be successful in the future. And we have to identify these skills as well. So, and key, and that's what Stuart and we talked about a little bit, is students, in order to be successful, no matter what the material is, they need to be engaged with the material. Yeah, and there are different ways students react to different types of instruction, and we got to keep that in mind. So, and there might be different ways we can present information, and really embrace the individual personalized learning path that students have, and allow for opportunities to have students develop their skills according to their own interests and so on. And that's really a change management effort that we're talking about. This is not easy. We've seen a lot of benefits to it, as we talked about, but as we hinted at, there's a lot of change management initiatives, and that takes place on the learner side. Students don't necessarily buy into this model, so there needs to be some convincing that has to happen, and students need to see the benefit of that learning that often comes because they're used to a different format. And if there's something new, people tend to be skeptic, particularly in the beginning. In addition, these interactive activities take a lot of time to plan as well as to implement. So you need to find the time to make this happen in the limited time that is available. One design solution that we found for math is by using this blended approach where we had instructors record the lectures beforehand, and students were held accountable to watch those before they come to class. Similar students sometimes, don't necessarily want to talk to their peers. They want to say, I want to talk to an expert, and they see the instructor as the expert in the class. And that's something that really needs shift in mindset as well, because we are all individuals. We can all learn from each other, and in particular as well, we need to work with each other in the future. So there's collaboration that is necessary, and these skills need to be integrated into the curriculum as well. And something we, Dale and Stuart and I, are very familiar with is the loss of control of the classroom. At times, there's the belief that when students are discussing or interacting, that there's a loss of control and we don't know where they are in their learning paths. And this is actually the opposite, as we saw with some of the Alex graphics and so on. We know much more. We have a better understanding what our students are, and it's just a different type of instructional methods. So, Dale, I'd love to hear you talk about this as well, but I'm going to introduce this. So something that we are seeing as we are thinking about, okay, where does learning happen? Where do we conducting our assessments? And even that happened before we had the pandemic. Let's look at where all the different spaces that are available to where learning can happen. And we really have a spectrum there. On one extreme, we have formal learning spaces. These are the classrooms. These are these are the schools, the institutions that we have. But our learners spend a lot of time outside these classrooms as well, right? And these what we call informal learning. So what can happen? What can we do to make that learning more efficient and also give students credit for this type of learning as well? So let's take advantage of not just one limited space. Let's open up the whole space. And very similar to particular now with the pandemic, it becomes very visual, is the vertical spectrum, where we can, of course, and we should have physical learning spaces, but also we can expand and build on this by using some of these virtual spaces like Zoom. The internet has made a lot of spaces available to us that are previously not. And also technologies like Alex allows us to expand really the different areas where learning can happen.
So this was the slide that I was thinking about when I said this is a smart audience, because you were already anticipating and asking questions about this slide 30 minutes ago. This is the future. This is the reality today, and we have to adapt to this reality. We are struggling, and that's true in the United States as well, to adapt to this new dynamic. 10 years ago, we were all in the lower right-hand quadrant in classroom instruction. Today, we've moved up and maybe a little bit to the left on my screen. What we're trying to do is we're trying to find the balance. So as you think about where you are, what technology is available to you, look for a balance. It's not that you have to be like Arizona State University. You have to be better at your university. And that balance will be different, just like every learner has unique needs. So this is what we're trying to emphasize here, is this new dynamic that includes formative assessment, summative assessment, project-based work, personalization. All of the things that you hear about now are becoming possible. And we know that there are limitations in Morocco and even in the United States. When we went to remote learning in March of last year for COVID-19, we had thousands of students who didn't have computers. And we had to figure out how to provide them. So don't feel bad if you struggle with this, because we all do. And it's really a matter of finding our unique set of resources to help us get there, to build this holistic assessment environment. And I want to finish by covering a couple of thoughts about the frontiers here. I'm trying to summarize what we've talked about in a way that helps you understand what you have to adjust to in the future. Every student has unique educational needs. This has always been true forever, since the beginning of time. What we can do today is find out what those unique educational needs are, and we have to do that. We have to use the technology to enable more frequent assessment. Even if you're just using a classroom survey, raise your hand, give me some feedback, do a quiz. You have to find ways to integrate that into your teaching process. Peter mentioned that active learning skills are the critical future of education. And what we're doing is we're preparing students for their future life, their professional life. When we think about that, we think about these skills I mentioned earlier: collaboration, communication, critical thinking, creativity. These are the skills that will turn them into lifelong learners. We want our students to think about learning as a continuous process, not a 4-year degree, because the environment and the economy are changing so quickly that what they need to know now is going to be different from what they need to know in 10 years. And we have to prepare our students for this reality. What we want to do, and the reason we wanted to do this session, was to encourage you to integrate your assessment strategy with your learning outcomes to find that alignment and help the students succeed in this way. So we've got resources. There are lots and lots of resources, and Peter can share a link in the chat, or we can send this out to everybody after this webinar. There are many, many, many good books about how to do this well. And we'll take more questions. I apologize a little bit for going over, but Stuart was giving us such good questions that we hopefully covered a lot of the questions that you had. We still got about 10 minutes, I believe, to continue the conversation.
I think that we're so grateful to the two of you for sharing all of this information. And I'd like to touch on just a few remaining questions, maybe in the form of a kind of fast round, as it were, of question and answer. I think that one of the core questions that one of the themes is that we've heard before too, is that if assessment is so critical, do we end up taking time away from learning? And I'm wondering, Peter, if you could speak to kind of maybe whether that's an unhelpful separation, right? Is learning and assessment actually an integrated process?
Yeah, excellent question. So yeah, I would agree with the later part of your statement. So I mean, assessment is a key part of the learning process, and needs to be integrated into the design and so on. So I would not really think about it as a separate, I guess, phases and so on. But I think about it, you can also think about assessment as an activity, right? Particularly if it's a formative, like the chef tasting the couscous, right? You want to make sure that it tastes the right way that you have it intended. And at that time, you have to assess the couscous and the progress you're making at several times. So from an instructional design perspective and from a teaching and learning perspective, assessment is integrated into the learning process. It helps, of course, instructors assess the students' performance and knowledge at that time. But also, as I mentioned, it gives the learners feedback about their own progress, as well as their own learning, and also the effectiveness of the overall lesson itself. So,
Thank you so much for that. Dale, I'm wondering if you could speak to the ways in which learner difference plays a part in this. Questions around learners with different levels of abilities, whether those be physical differences, neurological differences. How can assessment take into account those aspects of the student experience and the student need?
Yeah, the key here is discovery. When I think about learning and assessment, they are the same thing. There is learning going on during assessment, and we learn from our mistakes. So discovery of different learning needs, different abilities, different socioeconomic situations, that's the natural first step. And the second piece is development. What are you going to do with the information that you discover? That's the hard part. The transformation in the teaching culture requires us to take action. Data without action is worthless. We do not want to collect an assessment result if we cannot act on that data. That's a critical decision point when you're teaching and you discover that the majority of your students did not understand the last lesson. So you have a decision. Do you go back and try to help them learn it again, or do you keep moving forward? And they have to go figure out their own development process. These are the kinds of things that we're trying to create in our design process with the faculty members. What do you do when you discover the students need help with their development? That for us is the critical insight that helps the students succeed at a higher rate.
Thank you for that. I think there was I think that question sort of also brought up sort of as a add-on question, regardless of student ability, if, for example, as Peter, as you were saying earlier, a student can meet the same criteria with, say, a video blog or a paper, right? Can those be assessed, analyzed in the same way so that the data of that, right, is equally valid? Or does the fact that there's a diversity of assessment make the data less interpretable, less valid, et cetera?
No, so certainly these paper and the video can be assessed in a very similar way so that they are comparable. And something that we brought up was the concept or the tool of a rubric, where you identify as the instructor what are the criteria that you plan to assess or provide feedback on. And let's assume you for the video versus the paper, you want to assess how students grasp the content, how they synthesize information, maybe apply it to their own lives. And these are all standards that you can create ahead of time as part of the rubric. And then the format itself of the artifact that students submit, whether it's a paper or an audio recording or video recording, does not really matter. So there are ways you can design an assessment strategy that incorporates alternative assessments to alternative formats in this case.
And I would add the word fairness to that process. In order to be fair, you need the rubric. And that will give the students confidence that regardless of the format that they submit, the grading will be fair.
So we're so close to the end. I want you to give one quick last answer, Dale, to this question, which is, we said earlier that we're trying to diversify the types of assessment we do, moving from singular high-stake assessments to ongoing assessment and experiences. But we're not saying throw out the multiple choice test, right? It can still have value. How do these systems help us actually to make multiple choice tests better tools, right? Actually, does this help us build, as we might say, a better mousetrap, right, in terms of multiple choice assessment?
Yes, I think what I like is a metaphor of a stairway to success. So you still have your summative assessment. It could be a multiple choice exam, but you need to build the stairway to get to the student, to get the students to that point. And if you use these other techniques, then they will be more successful on your final summative assessment. Ultimately, the goal is to prepare them to succeed, not to punish them for failure. And if we can get that change in the mindset that our goal is to prepare them to succeed and enable them to succeed, not to try to prevent them through a punishing summative exam from passing the course. That's how the culture in the United States has changed over the last 50 years. And there are still professors who rely on the high stakes exam, summative, but most now are building that stairway to success. And that's what we encourage. I would add right now, Stuart, you're looking at this slide. We have a little bit of a homework assignment for everyone as we're finishing up here. Peter suggested we do this. We call this the 1, 2, 3 activity. We want you to go home or after the webinar, write down one new idea that you learned, write down 2 things you want to try from this webinar, and then write down 3 things, 3 ways that you want to implement those new ideas. So 1, 2, 3.
Wonderful.
And this is just a little comment. This is an assessment by itself, just because it helps you reflect on the content It helps you to synthesize some of the information and also reflect on your own learning at the same time. Just throwing this in. That's why we wanted to do this.
This is our final assessment for you.
This is our high stakes assessment. So that ends us perfectly at time. And so I'd like to first start by saying thank you so much to Dale and Peter for joining us today. Always good to talk with wonderful colleagues at Arizona State University. I'd like to also extend a very warm thank you to our participants, always asking amazing questions, always showing such deep concern for students and the learning process. And we're so grateful for your questions and your presence. You help us become better presenters and better educators ourselves by interacting with you. I'd like to remind everyone that we are issuing certificates of attendance for these webinars that will be sent out in the weeks or two following the webinar. And we are also offering a digital badge for participants who attend 4 or more and complete a short reflective exercise as part of having gone through this webinar series, much like the 1, 2, 3 activity that Dale and Peter sent us. So again, on behalf of Arizona State University and the U.S. Embassy in Rabat, thank you so much for your participation in this webinar. Thank you again to Dale and Peter, and we hope to see you again next month for our next webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.